So our teaching text today is from John 1:14 through 18. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was already before me.' Out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." This is the word of the Lord.
Martin Shaw is a storyteller. He's spent half his life collecting stories, and now he travels around the world and tells them. He tells them in large stages and in lecture halls, in pubs, around fires. Martin is a Christian thinker, whatever that means. He's the author of 17 books, including a new one called Liturgies of the Wild. He's a mythographer. He was a guest professor at Cambridge. He's actually coming to New York City in a couple of weeks if you're interested. But I love how he tells his story of how he kind of found his path in life. He was 26 and experiencing some health problems, and he ends up giving up his music career. He's been performing in rock bands in his 20s. And he literally went into the hills. This is how I heard him describe it this week. "I lived alone in a tent for 4 years to pick up oral storytelling, like an old bardic apprenticeship." I'm going to give you a quote from him, but only the last part is going to be on the screen so you can just listen like it's the 90s for a second. I just left and lived in a black tent on a succession of English hills. During that period, I would have lit about 1,000 fires in my tent, and every time I sat by the fire, I learnt a new story. And so what that meant was when 4 years was done, I had the best part of 1,000 stories circulating in my head. Often just little folk tales, nothing terribly glamorous, but whilst I would say myths in general are a phenomenal transcript of the conditions of living, what I did not come across was anything like the subversive teachings of this fellow Yeshua, because he sort of seems to turn everything on its head. The Beatitudes terrified me because this wasn't Beowulf, this wasn't Odysseus. What do you mean the first is last? The last is first. They didn't seem obviously heroic to me at that age because he is the strangest of gods. I've always said this. He's the strangest of gods. If you're a mythologist, he doesn't behave. What kind of God is born a fugitive, dies an outlaw, and has the audacity to come back? That's wild information. Martin says after he really wrestled with the story of Jesus over and over again, and he has this sort of way of prescribing that you take a story and put it in your own mouth and live with it, and don't just hear it, but try telling it. And he has his own description is that eventually the story of Jesus defeated him. And maybe that's not a way that feels super hopeful for you, but I think he means that the construct and the pride and everything that had let him keep that story at a distance finally kind of collapsed under the reality of this wild God. And so in his 50s, or right at 50, after thinking the faith that he had been taught as a child was far too tame, he called it too indoors, he had a faith experience with Christ. And I think about Martin's story because I relate to it a little bit. I also think about it when I read something like John 1, because I have to tell you, friends, this is the kind of story that is a little bit hard to read. And I don't mean like it's hard to sound out the words and know what's being said. I mean to read this as it's intended, to let it really shock you You have to really hear it. And to really hear this story, I think you have to, well, some of us may have to move past some overfamiliarity. We may have to move past some indoorness that can get inside of our Christianity. Some of us may need to move outside of distraction. It's like I can't remember the last time my brain just went on a train of thought like undeterred for a long period of time. There's so many things vying for your attention. And ultimately, they're different ways that this story is kept at a distance. And so some of you may not have the problem that I'm describing, but if you've been in church for a long time, I want to tell you from personal experience, it is easy to hear the Word became flesh and dwelt among us and think, did I put the deposit down on the Airbnb for our trip in April? Or is my boss going to be in on Monday? Or are there carbs in cheese? How am I going to pay for my tooth to be fixed, right? Like you hear the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, this staggering statement. And it's like really the next thought is about something fairly mundane, about the internet speed in your house or whatever. Yeah, we sometimes hear something as profound as this in church and we can skip right over it in our hearts and minds, and we kind of put the Word became flesh and dwelt among us in this floaty, semi-poetic church space that is vaguely inspirational, but it is not as urgent as my spouse has this diagnosis that we're facing right now, or I had this deadline at work in 2 weeks, or I had a fight with my friend and I've been playing in my head what I wish I said to them over and over, or I have a midterm to take this week, or I possibly would like to manage a third date with this person that I'm hitting it off with, but I don't want to seem over the top. You guys are human beings, right? Great. And John is kind of inviting us to sit by the fire and to hear something that's meant to blow our minds and really break our categories and shock our systems a bit. We are spending a little extra time in this prologue to the Gospel of John because it's so rich you can wring out every sentence. And we've already been saying this phrase, the Word was with God and the Word was God, that John uses at the beginning. He's kind of pulling two really wide streams of thought together, the Greco-Roman world and the Hebrew world. He's speaking to both of them. When he says the Word, it's this word in Greek, logos, and it's really hard to translate with just a single English word. And so, scholars literally debate around how to phrase this poem at the beginning of John. But the word, the logos, to the Greeks is really this oldest, deepest principle of rationality and meaning. It's what the philosophers were after. It's sort of what they believed the best life would give you space to contemplate and really dive into and pull together in a meaningful way and give shape to everything, in a sense that for the Greeks to hear the logos is a person is kind of category breaking. It's intended to be like shocking when you read that. And to the Hebrews, it's even more so, right? Every day of their lives, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. This is their confession as a people. And all of a sudden to hear that the Word was present with God from all eternity past, was active in creation in a personal way, that literally the creation was spoken through this Word. And now this Word is a person. This Word is God. It is category breaking. That God took on a body. The Logos, the Word, the one there at the beginning, the one participating relationally and personally in creation, took on skin and tissue and sinew and a nervous system and dwelt among us. The word dwelt here is literally translated tabernacled. The Word became flesh, took on a body and tabernacled, put up a tent in our midst. John is saying he was among us. We saw him, we ate with him, we embraced him, we walked with him. He's saying God has an address, which is a weird thing to say. God has a physical point of reference in history. That the meaning of life is not a principle, it's a person that you can love and that loves you. This person is God. God drew near and dwelt among us in a tent. So, I would like to take this moment to give you the abbreviated but crucial timeline of two very important tents. The room is not as excited as they should be about this. Come on, buckle up, folks. So to do this, I'm going to run you through an overview section of some chapters in Exodus. Actually, if you're doing the Bible in 1 year, buckle up. You're going to be here soon. You're going to be coming up on these. But the story of Exodus, as you remember from the animated Disney film, Prince of Egypt, thank you very much, is a story of God hearing the cries of his people in slavery and rescuing them in a dramatic and relational way through Moses and friends. And so God gets his people out of Egypt, but then he has this actually more challenging work to do, it seems, if you look at the story, and that's to get Egypt out of them. He gets them out of Egypt, but he has to get Egypt out of them. This sort of like mentality of slavery that they had lived with for hundreds of years, this culture of the empire, this idolatrous machine that had been churning through their lives. God sets them free from the machinery of the empire, but then he has to get that ethos, that philosophy, that way of being out of them so they can walk as the free people of Yahweh. And so let me tell you, it's a bumpy ride. And in Exodus 19, Moses goes to meet with God on Mount Sinai. And what he's doing there is he's receiving God's instructions for how to live in the world and live with God. And so Exodus 20, Moses gets the 10 Commandments. And sort of like play them out as just like arbitrary instructions from God. There's lots of different ways to understand the law that God gives to the Hebrews in some different categories. There's moral law. There's a civil law, how to construct their society throughout a year, how to deal with lawsuits. There's civil, there's ceremonial, and there's moral. So there's like different categories of law. And the 10 Commandments at the beginning, it's like, this is, if you want to thrive as a society, let's get some basic things out of the way here. Don't kill one another. Very hard to thrive as a society if you're killing, okay? Don't steal from one another. People hate that. Don't take someone else's spouse, okay? Keep a Sabbath. And so it's these things God's giving his people for how to thrive. Very different from the world they had just come out of in Egypt. So Exodus 20, Moses gets the 10 Commandments plus many more. Literally 5 chapters worth of instructions for how they're to live. And then at the end of Exodus 25, God says, I'm going to live with this people in the midst of them. And so he says at the end of Exodus 25, have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you. And so this, my friends, is the beginning of tent number 1. We're doing this? All right, Exodus 26. So God begins instructions for the tabernacle. It's one of those parts in the Bible in a year that can be a little dull initially. But it's this really detailed description of this tent where God is going to dwell in the midst of his people who are now freed from slavery and walking with God. But Moses has been up on the mountain for a long time. And actually people start to get restless. They start to really question what's going on here. A lot of times pain, frustration, delay in our lives makes us question what we believe. And this happens to the people in this journey. And so we see in Exodus 32, they say we need something more concrete. This God way off, it's hard to imagine after everything they've seen, but they're like, we need a God right in front of us. And so they throw their jewelry in a fire and they make a golden calf. You remember that story? That's Exodus 32. And it's this kind of deep level betrayal. And rabbis say things like God was in the process of marrying his people. And if you look at an ancient Jewish wedding ceremony, what God is doing with the people, the Hebrew people, is very much like that. There's literally stages of this wedding process going on. And it's like on the wedding night, they had an affair. I mean, that's the level of sort of like betrayal and scandal. And so God tells Moses, hey, go and look at what's happening. Moses goes. Moses is devastated. God is not happy with this development. And so Exodus 33, God tells Moses, I'm still going to give you the land that I promised you, but I'm not going with you. I'm going to send an angel. I'm going to give you the victory that I promised, but I'm not going to be with you. And there's a mention here of tent number 2. It's called the tent of meeting. I want you to take note of it. It's actually chronologically before the tabernacle. This is where Moses would go. It was Moses' prayer room. It's where Moses would go and meet with God before the tabernacle was built. And it said when Moses wanted to inquire of God, he would go into the tent of meeting, and then he would come back to the people. And it says his assistant, his aide, Joshua, would stay in the tent. I love that little detail. But Moses spoke with God in this tent of meeting in deep intimacy, and he received revelation. And so Moses is pleading with God. He knows what it is for God to say, I'm going to give you victory, but my presence isn't going to go with you. And so he says, no, actually, God, please, no. If your presence doesn't go with us, then don't lead us up from here. We don't just want like a military victory and to occupy this land. We want to be with you. We want to be your people. And then Moses asked God this sort of staggeringly daring thing. He says, show me your glory. Let me see what you're really like. And God says, all right, I'm going to hide you in the cleft of this rock and you can see my shoulder. That's the deal they come up with. And then Exodus 34, Moses, there's some funny depictions of this in movies, but Moses gets upset and he breaks the stone tablets. And so God re-gives them. He gives the stone tablets, the 10 Commandments again, and Moses comes down and everybody notes that, well beyond a fabulous skincare routine, his face is glowing. He's seen the presence of God. He's seen God's shoulder blade. He's experienced this revealed presence of God that seems to be almost too much for a human being to handle. But throughout that story, there's these two tents. The tabernacle where God's going to dwell in the midst of his people, and the precursor to it, this tent of meeting where Moses did that in advance of the wider community doing that. He's looking for, he's waiting for, he's pouring his heart out to God in this tent of meeting. And so when John says the word became flesh and made his tent among us, made his dwelling among us, this is the history he's drawing from. We have seen his glory. What are you talking about? He's pulling directly from this Exodus story, directly from the Moses account. The glory of what? Of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The Word came and set up a tent in our midst. So our minds are meant to go to the tabernacle, meant to go to the tent of meeting. All along, this story has been coming to bear. God is going to dwell in the midst of his people. And you're going to see now, in whatever is happening now, this new chapter, you're going to see now something that you've never seen before. You're going to speak face to face with God in a way that even Moses didn't in his time. John 1 goes on. Out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. There's a lot of debate on that phrase, receive grace in place of grace already given, because it kind of doesn't feel like it makes sense initially. It's like he gave grace instead of grace. And you're like, wait a minute, you should have had something different there. That's how sentences work. But actually, it's saying basically God is giving grace in place of grace already given, that God's entire project has been grace. That's the way God operates. And sometimes, especially if you get into the Old Testament stories, right, it can raise some real intense questions, and I think they're really worth wrestling with. But I think using Jesus as a lens to interpret through is really important. But it's not like God tried anger and judgment and law and it didn't work that well, so now he's come around to grace. No, the entire Torah is grace. Every ounce of the story at every turn has been grace. But now grace has an address in history, a new way that it is being embodied in the person of Jesus. Now you're going to see something like you've never seen before. It's a life of grace, a life where God is revealed. If you look just at Jesus' teaching, it's different than the world had ever seen at that point. It sounds sort of like the type of words you might expect God to say. As Martin Shaw put it, he was born an outlaw, died a fugitive, and came back with an embrace, with these instructions for how to thrive in life and how to live beyond. And in the 3 years of Jesus' public ministry, what's he doing? Well, lots of stuff, but he's making the Father known. He's making the Spirit known. We're getting a glimpse inside the reality of this God. That is, when we say God is holy, sometimes we mostly think about like perfect and spotless, and holy means other. It means set apart. And the holiness of God is profound in that God as a being is other than us. And one of the ways we're learning through the revelation of Jesus and the Spirit that God is other than us is that God is somehow able categorically to be three in one. And we've talked about this before, but if you play for, like the hierarchy of beings on earth, from like stone to plant to golden retriever to human being, there's huge jumps there. Like the relationship possible between a human being and a plant can be real and profound between a human being and a golden retriever. But if you try to explain to your golden retriever how to do your taxes, it's very difficult. There are concepts the retriever, as sweet as she is, does not understand. And if you were to imagine, extrapolate, and make that leap from human being to God, like somehow you're like, it's a different category. Somehow God is three and one, and Jesus is making known the Father to us and making known the Spirit to us, and we're getting a glimpse inside this divine community, this dance, this cosmic mystery of the reality of God's presence. That is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God was never alone. God is in community from the very beginning. And John tells us no one has ever seen God. You know, Moses got the shoulder blade. It says in Exodus that he spoke with God face to face, and we can only assume that means some kind of diffused version. But the one and only Son, who is himself God, is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. That verse 18, listen, Bible translators have a huge task on their hands. And so there's times when, there's literally books written about just a translation of one of these words. But here in the NIV it says, the Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. And it just sort of seems like, you know, Jesus and the Father are pretty good pals. No one knows him better, really. Closest relationship we've got, so we'll start there. But the phrase that's actually there is translated in the bosom. Now, just to compare for one moment, they're pretty good pals versus in the bosom. I've referenced this before, but if you want to test this out, in the bosom is like you're laying your head on their chest. If you want to try this on the subway to see how much intimacy you need with someone for that to be possible, I would say beware. It's quite a lot. It's quite a lot of intimacy required to lay your head on someone's chest. It connotes, right, this intimacy, this welcome, this closeness, and this is the picture that John is giving us. Jesus, who is himself God, is in the bosom of the Father, is showing us what God is like. Like, if you want to know what God is like, I would like to know what God is like. That you can look at Jesus and you can know with integrity that is what God is like. To me, that is deeply comforting. This phrase, in the bosom, is used in the New Testament two other times. One, a man has died, and he is said to have been in Abraham's bosom. And that's a bit mysterious. I literally have nothing to say about that except it's weird. Okay, but there's another time this phrase is used, and it's at the end of the Gospel of John, and John the disciple who's writing this is at the Last Supper, and it says John is in the bosom of Jesus. He lays his head at the Last Supper on Jesus' chest. It's a pretty beautiful full circle moment. The Son, who is himself God and is in the bosom of the Father, has made him known to us. And by the end of Jesus' life and ministry, as he's about to enter the darkest, deepest, most challenging night of his life, as he's going to go to the cross willingly, John, his friend, who identified himself as the disciple Jesus loved, laid his head on his chest. He said, what Jesus had with the Father, I have with Jesus. And then Jesus is going to pray in John 17 that you and I would have that same thing. That you would know you're in the bosom of the Father. Some of you are like, I haven't been keeping my resolutions. I don't think God likes me very much. Your first instinct is that God's frustrated with you and that you're not doing enough. And I'm not making light of the many mistakes and sins and brokenness that pervade our lives and that we perpetrate and that we do harm to one another. I'm not making light of that, but God's nature and redemption is so profound that he's able to overcome any level of brokenness to welcome us into the family so that you and I can lay our head on his chest, that you can be in the bosom of the Father the way Jesus is in the bosom of the Father. There's a commentary on this in Hebrews 1. It's one of the best in the New Testament. Sort of summarizes everything we've been talking about. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things and through whom also he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. And after he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. You cannot know God this way except through Jesus. That's not a statement of religious triumphalism. It's a relational reality based on the nature of God. There isn't another Son. If there was another way up the mountain of faith to find God at the top, same as everyone else, and Jesus didn't have to die, you can think of the absurdity of the cross in that. Like, this is the way. Because we're talking about the nature of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so we're not like debating philosophies here. We're talking about the nature of reality. But also, I just want to say, Jesus is really good. Like, worthy of our worship. I'm been in Brooklyn for 22 years now, or 21 years, and I come in out of my week sometimes with a chip on my shoulder, and I'm like, why are these people singing? And some of them are emotional. Why are they raising their hands? And I'm tired of this song and whatever, and I just sort of go through my little pity party. But then every now and then the Spirit will just remind me what I'm doing. That I'm lifting my eyes off of my selfish self for a moment, and I'm looking at Jesus, who is worthy of praise, who has made a tent among us and taken on weakness and taken on frustration and brokenness and hunger and thirst, and all the way to the point of this torturous death on the cross to say to me, come and lay your head. Come and lay your head on God's chest. Sounds wild. Jesus is worthy of our worship. He's worthy of our devotion. He's worthy of our lives. There are so many lesser things that have their hands around our hearts, but Jesus is welcoming us into this grace project that God has always been about. Jesus is in the bosom of the Father. He's saying, come and lay your head down. And John does this, and he shows us what God is like. Jesus shows us the Father. He gives his life to bring us into union with this triune God, and he changes how we think about God. In a sense, if you track this with John, he's saying Jesus comes and he makes the Father known to us because he's in the bosom of the Father. And then by the end of the story, John's gospel, John's head is on Jesus' chest, and he's making Jesus known. And so in a sense, the takeaway of this poem is that our lives are meant to reflect who Jesus is in such a way that someone would experience the way we live, or the way our community operates, or the way we forgive, or the way we're generous, or the way we're loving, or the way we're merciful, or the way we keep showing up, or the way that we pray, and they would know they too can come and lay their head on God's chest. They too can be welcomed in as family, that there isn't some second-class citizenship for them because of where they started in the world, or the ways they've messed up, or the shame they've carried, or the brokenness that John is saying every single one of us is now representing this staggering love that is found in Trinity. Dane Ortland says, what should come to our mind when we think about God? The triune God is three in one, a fountain of endless mercies, extending to, meeting, and overflowingly providing for us in all our many needs and failures and wanderings. This is he who is Father. This is who he is, Father no less than Son, Son no less than Father. And John is showing us our calling here. This is your calling, friends, and mine, to lay our head in the bosom of Christ, to be received, to be welcomed, to be invited to rest. Just going to pause there for 1 second and say, in our pre-service prayer, we were praying, and this theme of rest came up several times. And I just want to say, this is what Jesus says: if you're weary and heavy laden, come to me and I will give you rest. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. So if you're walking around with a yoke that is not easy, that is not light, then there's a chance it's not the yoke of Christ. And Jesus is saying, come to me and I will give you rest. Come and lay your head on my chest. So you're invited to rest, you're invited to forgiveness, you're invited to union, and then you are also, as you experience that intimacy and that welcome, you're invited to make Jesus known. That's what John is doing here with this writing, to make him known by our lives, to make him known by being filled with a spirit that makes Christ full of God in that way, and that same spirit fills us. That's what we're going to talk about next week. We're making Jesus known by living the integrity of his teachings. It's such a mind-bending thing in American Christianity right now, to have people claiming faith in Christ and nothing to do whatsoever with his teachings. It is a head trip, and it messes people up. And so our way of inviting people to lay their head on the chest of Christ is to live in integrity in Jesus' teaching. Like the wild, crazy stuff he really said about turning the other cheek, we're not just going to dismiss that and say, he was just showing how we couldn't quite get there and we needed him anyway. That is theological bad word. We make Jesus known by our lives, by being filled with the Spirit, by our integrity to his teachings, by how we pick ourselves up and return to his mercy even when we fail, and by living his way. And none of that is to force open the embrace of God because we've been such obedient religious accomplishers. It is to live in the overflowing love because the gospel is that he embraces us. That the way has been opened by Jesus when we were flat out enemies. When we weren't bringing a single thing to the table, God says, the door is open. Come on in, lay your head on my chest. Christ has opened the way. Christ has opened the way. Christ has opened the way. Church, he's worthy of worship. He's worthy of praise. He's opened the way. He's in the bosom of the Father, and he's showing you your invitation. I can't do anything better at the start of this year than tell you how spectacular Jesus is, and that there is no substitute. The epiphany of epiphany is to be embraced by this love. It is to rest your head on his chest. It is to come to Jesus, my friends, and we're going to now. We're going to come and eat. And we're going to be like John at the end of his story, is this very meal where he laid his head on Jesus' chest. Have you felt far from God? Come and pray. Come and draw near. Come and test the waters of his mercy. Have you been trapped in some shame cycle where it's like it's the 18th of January, all my resolutions are completely out the window, I'm beating myself up, I'm right back in the patterns I didn't want to be in? Come and receive grace on top of grace already given. You cannot exhaust the grace of God. Have you been representing something very different than Jesus? I invite you to come back and rest in his embrace. Maybe the evidence is you're bearing a yoke that is not easy, that is not light, that is white-knuckle, human strain, willpower effort. And that, friends, is hard to sustain over a life. Return to Jesus and be restored. Heavenly Father, will you lead us by your Spirit now in these next moments? As we come to the table, I want to pray that many of us would hear you speaking in the secret places of our souls, that you would speak to those spots in our inner being that we're reluctant to speak about to anyone. Would you speak to those places of woundedness or stubbornness or pride or apathy or distance? Would you melt our hearts with your love this morning? Jesus, we glorify you.